Welcome to IFA's Faithful Friday. My name is Fairbrother and I'm an interfaith minister. Love thy neighbour as thyself is the biblical guidance given in Mark 12:31. And I'm giving thought to the spectrum of consequences arising from that invitation. Great advice, I think, if we harbour a healthy self-regard and have love enough to share. But what are the consequences for our neighbours if we don't? If we don't love ourselves? Does little love for me mean little love for you? Is this the outcome? Love thy neighbour as little as thy love thyself. Considering our relationship with ourselves is an enormously difficult thing to do. We live in a culture fixated on doing rather than being, where self-love or self-reflection is commonly thought of as something of a self-indulgence. Indeed, we're often encouraged to put the needs of others before our own, to negate our own needs. Love thy neighbour as thy exhausted self, one could say. And as the saying goes, my friends, you can't fill a pint pot from an empty jug. In my view, self-care is a primary priority because how we are with ourselves affects how we are with others. And that might sound like a statement of the obvious, but I wonder how many of us take a turn to look inwards, to connect with what we're feeling, to explore what we're holding, and perhaps more importantly, why we're holding it. Of course, a prerequisite is our capacity for such exploration. Biographical excavation, as you could describe it, well, it's a tough gig. And it's important to acknowledge that there are times in life when it isn't always possible for a variety of reasons. Self-love in such circumstances derives from acceptance of this. And for those who have the capacity to walk this road, it's important to acknowledge the tremendous courage required to take the journey, for it's one laden with considerable risk. What if I don't like what I uncover? What if there's a gulf between who I think I am, or what I project out into the world, and what I find within? What if I encounter the wounds of the past? And what is the self that exists in the shadows within me? The extent by which we're able to meet with our shadow self reflects the extent that we're able to love ourselves as complex, often contradictory human beings. Coined by the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung, the shadow is the unconscious aspect of the personality that the conscious ego does not identify itself with, or the entirety of the unconscious, that is everything which a person is not fully conscious of. In short, the shadow is the unknown, or sometimes the known but disowned part of ourself. Everyone carries a shadow, wrote Carl Jung. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about themselves. And the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. It isn't easy acknowledging our shadow, never mind owning it. And more difficult still, any attempts to integrate it in a healthy way into a sense of who we think we are. And this is brave work, and it's tough work. Often we encounter aspects of our shadow in reaction to our woundedness. For example, our shadow might become visible to us in responses such as lashing out when we feel attacked. Here the shadow arises as a sort of protector, a self-defense in a way, triggered by fear and pain, and even perhaps fear of pain. It might be the case that we stereotype the shadow as some form of inner raging psychopath or sociopath, or deeply concealed inner narcissist, which we dare not unleash. For it's important to acknowledge that the shadow doesn't always present in such extreme expressions. It can be much more subtle, and sometimes it can be addressed in apparently noble intentions. Recently, I was moved to read the experiences of Brian Mueller, who spent a year training as a chaplain at Bellevue Hospital in New York. He tenderly describes meeting his shadow through hospital chaplaincy. I'd like to read to you the following words from an article he wrote for the UK newspaper The Guardian, published on the 25th of October last year, in which he explores his encounter with a previously unacknowledged part of himself. And these are his words. For much of the year at Bellevue, I worked in the emergency room where I encountered an endless procession of men and women battling addiction. I was drawn to these folks, probably, due to my own experiences with drug and alcohol, which led me to some counter-transference in these visits. In my first months, I pounced on any indication that someone wanted to change, and soon tasted the power of the reformer, the zeal of the crusader. One patient, a middle-aged African-American man who had a long history of substance misuse, homelessness, and incarceration. I ended up the visit with an appeal for him to forgive himself, to like himself, and to realize his full potential. Afterwards, I presented the script of my visit to my supervisors. When I finished reading, one of them smiled and asked, "Tell me, how long was that visit?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe about 20 minutes, perhaps." And he responded, "Wow. Here's a guy with a lifetime of trauma and addiction, not to mention abandonment issues with his mom. He tells you about living on the streets and spending years in prison. And here you go, turn his life around in a single 20-minute conversation. Congratulations," he said, with a wry grin on his face. "You're like the greatest chaplain ever." The lesson I slowly learned was that we cannot change people, nor is it our role as chaplains to even try. Our role wasn't to transform, but to meet the addiction and the despair with a presence that is neither anxious nor judgmental. A presence that can accompany a person to the places no one else wants to go, whether they're sober, high, or in the jaws of a Joel. To meet their humanity with their own, their vulnerability with ours. A friend liked to call it getting in their boats, which meant taking a journey into a liminal space that could be lonely and frightening. As I would eventually learn, it was a much harder kind of intervention, but more life-giving than a promise of salvation and a slap on the back. Powerful words by Brian Mueller. And the shadow that Brian presents here is that of the savior complex. And by acknowledging it, by exploring what gives it life, he describes how he consequently is able to steer a deeper relationship into this aspect of himself, and how he is able to bring this into service, into relationship, and into love for himself and for the other. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't easy work, and in Brian's words, he says, "Most of us find it hard to submit to this painful work of emotional processing. Long-held religious beliefs got called into question, old ghosts, past traumas, and slithery implicit biases got exposed. The scrutiny I encountered was humbling." Friends, this term or concept, biographical excavation, as illustrated by Brian Mueller in his journey, opens us to re-encountering and uncovering our wounds. The wounded healer, another term coined by Jung, refers to our capacity to be at home in the darkness of our own suffering. And the work of the wounded healer is a journey into and through the wounding, to explore it, to learn from it, to be open to the possibility of finding ourselves traveling from it to somewhere new. In that sense, the wound is our teacher, teaching us something about ourselves. Embracing our wound as part of ourselves is radically different from circumnavigating it, avoiding it, or getting stuck in it endlessly, obsessing and recreating and being taken over by it. Embracing our wound creates the conditions by which we may reach acceptance, we may reach forgiveness, love for ourselves and for others. Friends, a common thread that weaves between us, between you and I, is our yearning for connection, for relationship of all sorts, and perhaps most essentially, for love. And yet many of us are frightened of connection, fearful of what we'll encounter when we look into the eyes of another, perhaps fearful of seeing our own reflection in all that is broken and whole within us and between us. For we too are one. These words by Barbara Brown Taylor from her work An Altar in the World. The hardest spiritual work in the world is to love thy neighbour as thyself. To encounter another human being, not as someone you can use or change or fix or save or help or enroll or convince or control, but simply as someone who can spring you from the prison of yourself, if you will allow it. To return to the opening proposition, love thy neighbour as thyself. Yes. And let us learn from one another in nurturing our capacity for self-love as the foundation for our being with others, for being in relationship with others, from a place of being in relationship with ourselves. For there is no greater commandment than this.
So let's pause now and take a moment to let these profound words of Reverend Peter Fairbrother to settle. So inviting you now to find a comfortable position, one which you can feel relaxed, yet at the same time awake. And you might like to lower your gaze or close your eyes if that feels more comfortable. And just now bringing the attention all the way down into the feet. And really having a sense of the feet planted firmly on the ground. Really feeling into the sensation that this contact makes. And sensing into the seat beneath you and the full weight of the body moving down, a sense of gravity really holding you here. So there really is the possibility of simply letting be, letting go, nothing to do, simply being here. And then from the center of the sitting bones, feeling a sense of the spine rising up, sense of the height, and the feeling of the head planted all the way on top of the neck, shoulders releasing away from the ears, and the hands planted in the lap. And at this point, you might like to set an intention for this very short practice. And it might feel appropriate to really invite an attitude of kindness here, kindness towards the self, simply by paying attention. As Simone Weil says, it's really the rarest and purest form of generosity. So really choosing, if that feels okay, to bring the attention to the breath. And you might like to place a hand on your belly and simply feeling the breath here, having a sense of the abdomen wall as it stretches and rises on the in-breath and releases away and softens on the out-breath. Feeling the current of the breath moving in its own way. No need to change anything or fix anything. Simply choosing to rest here with the felt sense of the breath. What does it feel like? And you may notice that the mind will start to wander away from the sense of the breath. And that's okay, that's not a problem. It's simply what minds do. And as soon as you notice when this happens, there's a choice of choosing to bring the awareness back to the breath in a gentle and kind way. No need to be judgmental about this, simply accepting, this is where the mind has gone, and coming back. Having a sense of the texture of the breath. Is it soft? Is it smooth? Was it rough? Remembering there's no right way or wrong way. Simply how it is right now. Is it fast or slow? And in a moment, the practice will come to an end. Listening to the sound of the bell. And when you're ready to, maybe having a little stretch, opening the eyes if they've been closed, and moving on to the next part of your day. Thank you.